Lesson 2, why did all the victors not get everything they wanted? Had it been a little bit more savvy and a little bit more prepared, perhaps, I would have played You Can't Always Get What You Want by the Rolling Stones, which would pretty much sum up exactly what the situation was at the end of June 1919, when the three leaders of Great Britain, France, and the USA either returned to their homes or returned, in the case of British and the Americans, to their home countries. Now, let's put this in context, and it's really important to note. All of the big three, as you learned last lesson, had such different objectives. It would be impossible, under the circumstances, to satisfy the needs of all of the people involved here. Historians recently have come to a more moderate conclusion on the treaty. The historiography, which is the nature of what historians have agreed to and how that's changed over time as different people have written on the topic, has generally come in, let's say, the last 15 years or so, to a conclusion that given the circumstances and the moods, which of course have a lot of national sentiment and vengeance built into them in each of the countries at the time, and not to mention the fact that we're talking about people with early 20th century outlooks. These are not globalists. These are people who were born, raised, and educated in Victorian times, a time of imperialism, a time of great powers, etc., etc., etc. Given those constraints, which are almost impossible to get away from, the peacemakers, the big three, did about the best job they could have done under the circumstances. Yet, as we know, the treaties were far from perfect, and they left a legacy of problems which have plagued the 20th century, of course, leading to World War II, and in many cases are still with us today when we look at some of the complications surrounding the treaty in the Middle East, for instance, or Turkey. The mood in Paris also has to be considered. The peace conference is usually remembered as a failure. The participants, the big three, usually remembered as short-sighted, foolish. And this is massively unfair. The peacemakers, when you consider the multitude of issues, faced problems which defied solutions. It always needs to be remembered also that they were working in a context in the aftermath of the worst war that had ever been seen in modern history, arguably in world history. The signs of war were everywhere visible in Paris, even though Paris itself had barely been touched. You're looking at half the women on the streets in 1919 wearing black because they had lost someone, be it a son or a husband, in the war. There were gaps in the trees along the grand avenues in Paris because all of the trees had been cut down for firewood, such was the deprivation of the French people during the war. Many of the delegates also made the short trip northward to the battlefield of the Western Fronts, where they could see themselves the horror of the churned up battlefields, the bodies and the skeletons lying open, the rotting corpses, the smell, the destructions of the towns, and the deprivation of the people. It was not hard for these people to realize exactly what that war had cost. And the memories and the very visible signs of the war very much played a part in how this treaty would be decided. And it's very easy for us, sitting in the comfort of our living rooms in the 20th century, to judge these people harshly, not understanding the circumstances surrounding the mood in Paris in 1919. Many of the demands, when we looked at the treaty in the last lesson, you could probably see that many of the things that Clemenceau wanted were met in that treaty. France became the major recipient of German reparations, even though the reparations bill wasn't exactly as high as the French had wanted. France would get the majority of the money. Belgium would be the second biggest recipient, but largely the money went to France. France got border security to some degree. Germany was demilitarized. It could only have a standing army of 100,000 people, which you consider it was over 1 million at the start of World War I. That's a tremendous demilitarization of the German army. They had no navy or air force, etc., etc. Germany also loses significant amounts of land, which lessens their power. They lost a lot of their population, especially in East Prussia and to the south, into the Czech Republic. And their economic power and military capacity is incredibly weakened as a result. France, however, was still worried that the treaty left room for Germany to regain its strength and to potentially attack them today. One of the biggest concerns was the fact that the Rhineland itself was still technically part of Germany. They didn't get that buffer zone or that state between France and Germany that would guarantee, if you will, security for the French border. As a result, the French sought and were granted a treaty of guarantee. This meant that the United States and Great Britain would defend France again in the event of future German aggression. So in other words, if the Germans were to attack France, they would be attacking the United States and Great Britain simultaneously in this Treaty of Guarantee. This is something they didn't have before the First World War. In fact, Britain really goes into the First World War not only to defend France, but also to defend their ally and the neutrality of Belgium. The United States doesn't join the war at all for 3 years and is only convinced later on in 1917 to join the war, and cynically for that matter, because to be part of the post-war settlement, you need to be part of the war. So they're given here in 1919 a guarantee of international security so that France will have allies in the two strongest powers in the world, Great Britain and the United States. What is unfortunate about this, and we'll talk about this later on, is that this treaty doesn't necessarily happen. Though it's agreed and the big three shake hands on it, Wilson, as we'll find out, goes back to America and has to put the conditions of his agreements in front of Congress, and Congress votes against them. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles is not ratified, and one of the big hindrances to things like the League of Nations, et cetera, and France for that matter, is the fact that the United States, because Congress goes against Wilson, isn't bound to the agreements he made. Britain, of course, will not provide guarantees to France on its own, so France is left with a situation whereby Germany, if it becomes strong, could still attack their border. The dangerous exposure, and the fact that they felt dangerously exposed to German aggression again, rightly or wrongly, impacted on Clemenceau. His failure to secure border security forever, effectively, led to his defeat in the next general election. The United States, on the other hand, has a little bit of a mixed bag of success at the conference. Wilson had expressed ideas, which of course many Europeans have been talking about for generations. The 14 points weren't necessarily new, but he came to be seen as the spokesman for them, the harbinger of hope, if you will. In the great wartime speeches he made, particularly that in which he laid out the 14 points, he sketches out a sort of international relations where countries will deal openly with each other, where armaments are reduced to the bare minimum for safety, where trade barriers and tariffs will fall, where ships will travel the world seas without interference, where a new type of organization, a League of Nations, will bring its members collective security. To this end, I suppose, Wilson has partial success, but ultimately will leave the Paris Peace Conference with mixed feelings. The positives for the United States are fivefold. First, he convinces France and Britain to accept the League of Nations and the Constitution or covenant of that, and that this should be included in all of the peace treaties so that the League of Nations will now become the world police force, if you will, a place for people to sort of talk out their problems rather than solving them through military means. Not to mention the fact that in the second point, the requirement that the defeated powers should disarm pleased him, as this was a step toward the total disarmament. Even though it wasn't total disarmament, it was a step in the right direction. He was relieved that the French did not get an independent Rhineland. He wanted that to remain part of Germany. It reduced, in Wilson's eyes, the harshness of the peace treaty, and that's an important point, and ensured that Germany would remain an economic power and trading partner for the United States. The United States sold the majority of their grain, actually, before World War I and would after World War I to the German people. He was pleased that the reparations figure was not unrealistically high, and he was also pleased that self-determination in some cases, more particularly in the former countries that made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, such as Czechoslovakia, the new Slav superstate Yugoslavia, Poland, were to be governed by Poles, Czechs, Yugoslavs or Slavs, which is a combination of Bosnians, Serbs, and as you can probably tell, if you look at a world map today, that state didn't necessarily succeed. But nevertheless, it was a step in the right direction. At least Slavs would govern Slavs, and that was a positive for the United States, and it was a positive realization of several of the major components of Wilson's 14 points. On the other hand, there were three major negatives. The first one was the principle of free navigation of the seas. The British wouldn't budge on this, and Wilson decided that this wasn't the hill he was going to die on and abandoned it at the assistance of Britain, which effectively meant that the British Empire continued. Britain and France and Japan, of course, had, against the principle of self-determination, effectively rewarded themselves by taking Germany's former colonies in Africa and in Asia, and they said they would govern them as mandate territories on behalf of the League of Nations. Self-determination for some of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire was granted. There were some exceptions. Austria itself, actually, and largely speaking, at the end of the First World War, most Austrians wanted to join Germany into a German superstate, but Austria was forbidden to unite with Germany for fear of Germany becoming too strong with the United Austria. And this, again, ran counter to the popular will. The Sudeten Germans, approximately 3 million German-speaking people who lived along the border of Germany in the newly created part of country of Czechoslovakia, were actually part of Czechoslovakia. They were not consulted about their future, and they were forced into this new Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia, even though the Czechs had self-determination, it removed its very existence removed self-determination from approximately 3 million Germans living within the new boundaries of the Czechoslovakia. Now, all of this is moot in many ways because the Treaty of Versailles is rejected in Congress. It's important to note that American presidents cannot sign international agreements without two-thirds support in Congress. And Wilson was unable to convince the Republican Party that the Treaty of Versailles was in the interests of the USA. And there are three major reasons why he was unable to convince his opposition Republicans why it was. Number one, they had a small majority in the Senate. And with that small majority, they needed to play tough against the president. And unless the president gave them compelling reasons, there was little political reason for them to agree with them. Of course, Wilson is a big progressive, and I don't want to get into too much of this, but again, you see a very interesting partisanship, a breakdown in consensus in the American government at this particular time, interestingly enough, which sort of mirrors today. And the Republicans are very, 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 very skeptical of Wilson. They don't like him, and they're not willing to work with him unless the conditions are perfect. Wilson also has a tough time. He was a great negotiator, but at the end of the Paris Peace Conference, he was very ill with the cancer that would eventually kill him. This made him weary and frustrated. He quickly lost patience as he got worse. He was unable to persuade even the moderates in the Republican Party to support him, and as a result, they voted against the Treaty of Versailles. Many Americans, and this is important to note, did not want to be involved in future European conflicts. They detested the idea of the League of Nations because it made them risk being drawn into European wars. And this is a very American sentiment. A lot of American immigrants fled Europe and fled the wars of Europe, and they didn't want a situation where this new home, this new land of freedom, is now being drawn back into the problems of Europe. And Wilson was unable to sort of overcome this sentiment. And many people who felt like this voted for the Republican Party. Hence, the Republicans in Congress were more apt to reject the Treaty of Versailles because the votes that got them into Congress were dependent on keeping them out. So ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles is rejected in Congress, and things like the Anglo-American Treaty of Guarantee go by the wayside. But most importantly, U.S. participation in the League of Nations does not happen. And even though the League of Nations is actually created, the United States will play no part, and it severely weakens the impact of the League of Nations, as we'll see in later units. Great Britain, on the other hand, was probably the most satisfied with the treaty. Lloyd George had gone initially on a harsh peace, but had changed his mind, as you learned last lesson. He wanted a more moderate peace, one that would benefit the economic interests of Great Britain. Even though, he gets most of what he wants, it's important to note there are a few things he didn't like. He was weary about German-speaking people in Poland, France, in the region of Alsace-Lorraine, which was actually predominantly German-speaking at this particular time, and in Czechoslovakia, to be ruled by people who weren't German, to be ruled by Poles, to be ruled by French, to be ruled by Czechs. And he foresaw that this could lead to trouble with Germany later on. In very many ways, he was absolutely right, seeing as the things that Hitler takes over initially are Alsace-Lorraine, Poland, the Sudeten area, the German Southland, Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia at the start of World War II, or even before it. So Lloyd George, in many ways, predicted some of the issues with not giving self-determination to the German people here. Great Britain also, on the other hand, had some major achievements. First of all, Lloyd George persuades Clemenceau to be a lot more moderate towards Germany. He offers him this Anglo-American guarantee, and he's the key for negotiating this. Had it not been for David Lloyd George, the Americans would have never signed that Anglo-American guarantee. And in fact, the moderate stance that Clemenceau takes is in a lot of ways due to the fact that he was going to be given this guarantee, even though he doesn't get it in the end, as we know, because of course the Americans don't ratify it. The British interests are furthered by expanding their colonies. Of course, Lloyd George, as you know, is very much concerned about protecting, if not expanding, the British Empire, and he enriches himself in the peace treaties to the tune of 1.8 million square miles of land, 13 million new subjects. In fact, the British Empire in size peaks in 1919. It is as big as it ever will be at that particular point. The fact that Germany scuttles, which means sinks its own fleet, out of, in fact, the treaty demands, or the armistice demanded that Germany turn over its fleet to the British. And to avoid doing so, to avoid this humiliation, the German Navy actually sinks its own fleet off the coast of Scotland in 1918. And though, you know, this is somewhat of a disappointment to the British, who would have got all of these German ships, it also destroys Germany's navy entirely. And Britain is now the unchallenged master of the seas. If you recall, maybe year 9 or maybe in another way, one of the things that led to World War I was the arms race, and much of the arms race had to do with the building of battleships. Germany wanted to rival the size of the Royal Navy to ruin or threaten Britain's grip over the oceans of the world. And of course, in one move, the Germans sink their entire navy and therefore remove German naval threat to British Royal Navy dominance. Lloyd George felt that the treaty was relatively fair, actually. He believed it punished Germany adequately without destroying their economy or the ability to contribute to the prosperity of Europe. And of course, he saw this as good for business. He also saw that business succeeding as a bulwark to the threat of communism, because when things go poorly, the communist message resonates with the people more. He thought that this treaty allowed for the prevention of the spread of communism and German business to continue to thrive. He was both right and wrong in this respect, but nevertheless, that's what he felt. Unlike in France or the USA, it's important to note that the House of Commons will vote overwhelmingly in favor of the treaty. The French do not, as we see by Clemenceau's being ousted in the next general election. We know very well that the USA doesn't ratify the treaty, but the House of Commons is overwhelmingly thrilled with Lloyd George's work, and they vote for the treaty overwhelmingly. So why didn't they get what they want? Well, number one, it's impossible. Number two, each had their own sort of goals, and these goals were often contradictory toward one another. And in order to meet all of these goals, there would have to be compromise, and compromise means not getting what you want. We see that Great Britain probably does the best, but you know, also too, we have to say, apart from their demand for expanding their empire, they probably wanted less going into this. So it was easier to satisfy the gains of Great Britain. Wilson's 14 points are only partially realized, and France, of course, fails in its major objective of getting a buffer state or border security, and this has disastrous consequences, of course, for the prime ministership, or rather the presidency of Georges Clemenceau. So that is the end of this unit. We'll go further into the economic and political ramifications on Germany in particular of this Treaty of Versailles. You know, we'll see if the modern historical claim that the Treaty of Versailles was probably as fair or as good as they were going to do can be justified when you consider what happened to Germany in the post-war world. But that's a topic for our next lesson. Have a good one.